Okay, this is a story about this guy called John Brinkman, and he used to live in Melbourne, and he was an accountant, and he worked, I think, as an actuary, which is something to do with tables. No, not those tables, like different tables. Something life, death. I don't know what he was doing really, but he really liked Melbourne, I know that, and because he was sort of like a stable guy, and Melbourne's like a really stable place, and he knew all those tram routes by heart, and he knew to take always an umbrella everywhere he went, but there was one thing missing there, and that was love, because John Brinkman was a man who was, well, he was a loser really, and he was unlucky in love. And that was the term someone said, and you know, it was true, that's what he was. So when one day his boss said to him of the accountancy firm, there's a position in Sydney, and we want you to take it. He thought really long and hard, and then he went, yeah, why not? And so he moved to Sydney. And when he saw like the view of Bondi, the surf from the picture window in the sunroom of his new apartment, and there was a green sea, and there was blue sky, and there were red roofs, and he felt like unaccustomedly elated, because basically he was sort of depressed there in Melbourne, and he didn't even know it. Like, all of a sudden you realise that the first day of the rest of your life, that phrase, it entered his head, and he wanted to sort of hum the theme song to Cabaret and all sorts of things. And he got all giddy, and he had to suppress all impulses, like to skip like a little boy. And like so, but he did. He skipped to the real estate office, and he signed his name on the lease with a smiley above the I in Brinkman. And he was walking around Bondi, and he saw this shop, the gelato bar, and he saw all these cakes, and so he bought a poppy seed like strudel, and he disregarded completely his irritable bowel syndrome, and he ate it. And you know, that night in bed, even though the colic spasms, they were keeping him awake, he remained like really happy and gleeful, really. At work, in his new office there, at his desk, to his left he could see like Darling Harbour, and there was all construction, and it was like a new beginning, and maybe he wouldn't be an evolutionary cul-de-sac. Maybe things would work out in Sydney for him. Even his previously recurrent anxieties about cancer, even they had disappeared. Yeah, it had all changed. So in the office, across the aisle, was a beautiful woman, and that was Trish Helm, and she was like gathering a national reputation in the tax field. And John, he really admired her ability with figures, and even he admired her figure, basically. She had like a good figure, and a pert figure, and a diaphanous see-through blouses, and brains and beauty, and that combination was lethal, and John wished that would be the girl for him, but it was a wish. Still, he just didn't have the courage to go ahead and make a move, really. Well, he tried once, asked her if she was free tonight, and she went, "You must be kidding." And he said, yeah, he was kidding. So he tried that one, but he pretended that was a joke, really. So anyway, that evening in his apartment, his new apartment there at Bondi, he dined alone on bird's eye beef stroganoff for one, and his happiness, it sort of began to waver, because maybe he thought nothing's really changed, and his eye was throbbing. He was catastrophizing about going blind and wearing a small black eye patch, looking like Long John Silver or someone, and being taunted by little gangs of small kids all over the place, and even bitten by his guide dog. But he rose from the table, and he went to pour 20 mils of Mylanta, because he always drank that after every meal. And through the kitchen window, he noticed that it looked directly into the neighboring building, into the window of the neighboring building, and staring at him was like this really old woman, and she was sitting at a kitchen table, and her hair was dyed this unnatural dark brown color, and it was set like in a helmet style, but it wasn't really a helmet. It was more like Donald Trump or someone, and like her physiognomy, that was like all drooped with age and gravity, and she saw that John was looking at her, and he watched her observing him, and so she waved, and so he just nodded. He didn't know what to do, and she smiled, and he mouthed good evening, and then she raised her glass of Ribena, and he toasted her with his Mylanta, and she punched the air with it like a claw type of an arthritic fist, and he gave her like a thumbs up sign, and then, you know, he'd exhausted his repertoire of sign language, so he sort of like gestured goodbye, and he retired to the lounge room, and he switched on the TV, and on the TV there was this documentary of the Wadobe tribe in Central Africa, but he glanced up again to his left, and through the window the woman was still there, and because all the windows on that side faced straight into the apartment next door, into her apartment, and so he sort of made this mental note that in the morning he's got to ring those curtain makers, so that he needed that, because he couldn't cope really with that pantomime of communication, and etiquette always forced him to answer when he made a gesture, and they were there all night. It was really annoyed him. Okay, so the next day on the pathways, he heard this voice, this Eastern European voice, go, "White, why white?" And John sort of turned around, and then there she was, this old lady, and she was leaning heavily on a cane, and she was shuffling along the common walkway they had. She was lugging a red Woolworths bag, and she was even more ancient than he imagined from the night before. And so he went, "What? Sorry?" And she said, "The curtains, white gets dirty," she said to him. And so he explained that the woman at Nanton's said that it matches everything, and she said to him, "Never listen to people, and carry my bag." And so he said, well, actually, because he was in a rush to get to the bank, he went, "I've got to get to the bank." And she said, "I could break a hip getting up these stairs," and but he had to, you know, the bank was going to close in like quarter of an hour or something, and so he really had to get there. And so she said, "Well, you know, what's a broken hip when you've got to go to the bank?" And he said, "They're not cashing my checks, they're bouncing, there's something wrong with my account." And she said, "One snap of my hip, and that's all it takes, I'm a goner." And so he said, "Okay, I'll carry your Woolies bags up to your apartment." And so they got into her apartment, and the apartment was crammed with the relics of a really long life. There were sepia photos of the dead, and there were like 1940s maple veneer chests, and an 8-branched candelabra with dust, like Miss Havisham a little bit, and the ornaments were festooned like with stars of Davids, and there were souvenir thermometers and barometers and little sort of teaspoons with places that no one ever wants to go to, and no one knows what to do with those souvenir teaspoons, but she had them all, lots of them, and vases, and they had decayed silk roses in them, and there were layers of doilies and scarves, and there were materials over sofas and coffee tables, and in the middle there was a bedpan, and she sort of just said, "In the kitchen, put the bags in the kitchen." And so he put the bags next to the all bran, and she said, "No, on the table, put them on the table." And he said, "Well, I better get going," because he just did that quickly and thought, "I better get out, really." And so she barked at him, said, "What's your name?" And he said, "John." And she said, "John what?" And he said, "Brinkman." Her face, it lit up. It was like a light shone, because like he'd said something special, because she smiled at him, and she revealed these ill-fitting dentures, and there was a space between the incisors and the receded gingiva, which he really focused on and couldn't stop. He fixated a little bit on that for a while. She asked him for a cup of tea, if he wanted to have a cup of tea, and she couldn't take no for an answer. He didn't really want one, but he found himself like sharing this pot of tea against his better judgment. And so she was immediately asked him, "How come you're alone?" And she asked him if he was a loser. He sort of found himself, he was trying to justify his state, but Mrs. Klein, she wasn't fooled. He was a loser, it was obvious, but she would help him. But the thought of Mrs. Klein demystifying post-feminist females that were around, it seemed unlikely to John. She said, "You're like a dog without a master." And, you know, a Jewish man like John needed to be married. This wasn't the first time that John had been mistaken for being Jewish, because he had like hooded eyes, and his eyes were a deep brown, and his hair was sort of dark and wavy, what was left of it anyway, and an acquaintance had once sort of said that he seemed to have pleased to meet you features, and the acquaintance had wanted to shake hands with John's nose or something. But apart from that, like, he wasn't Jewish. There was no doubt. He had an Irish sort of a background, and though it's not to say that he didn't know about or like Jews or anything. He seen Schindler's List. He said to her, came clean and said to her, look, I'm not Jewish. And so she asked him, what are you? And he said nothing. But Mrs. Klein, when he said nothing, she went crazy. She said, never be ashamed of your background. She broke into the sort of a fit of coughing, and he thought she was going to collapse and die on him, and so he pounded her on a dowager's hump to sort of try and stop that coughing, and she was wheezing out, promise me you won't deny who you are, and wheezing and coughing and spluttering and stuff. And so he sort of said, he vowed he wouldn't, because basically he was scared that it would cause the demise of an old Jewish crone, and he didn't need that on his conscience, because life was already full of inner turmoil enough. And so she started to breathe easier as soon as he said that he wouldn't. And then she said to him to take the rubbish down from under the cupboard that was under the sink, to take it from that cupboard and take it down to the rubbish area. And so he did what he was told. And she yelled out, come Friday night, 7 o'clock. He wanted to say no, but he just couldn't. The next day at work, he was sort of like observing Trish Hone from a distance, of course, and tripped over the pot plant. She didn't even notice, apart from the fact that the pot plant was sort of on the floor, basically. So that Friday night, he found he didn't have anything better to do, so he found himself like at her old-fashioned manual doorbell, and he was goofily clutching a bunch of violets waiting for Mrs. Klein to answer. And he was like thinking in his own head that he was really worse than a loser, because he was having a tete-a-tete with a 90-year-old pensioner on a Friday night, and the swinging city of Sydney was like preparing for a wild night out. So he was getting more and more like disheartened, let's say. And so after an eternity, and he wondered perhaps she'd sort of like gone back to where some old age home maybe she'd be taken. But finally she got to the door, stepped into a flat, and he was assaulted by like an odor of chicken. Unexpectedly though, there were 3 settings, and John turned to see the third guest, who was lost in one of Mrs. Klein's oversized armchairs. And Mrs. Klein said, this is Deborah Schlimmel, and give her the flowers. He gave her those wilted violets, and Deborah Schlimmel, standing up, was the size that most people were seated. Like 10-year-olds would have towered over her, and she had doe eyes and a fragile build, and it made her appear like a kosher-style Bambi. And his immediate instinct was to protect this miniature woman-child from the bitter realities of some sort of an adult world. And he wanted to hold her lightly so as not to break her bones. She was so fragile looking. But paradoxically, her voice had the sound of a chainsaw. And so Mrs. Klein got them all to sit down at the table. Mrs. Klein and Deborah, they seem to have that ability to eat and chew and question simultaneously. And John assumed it was a Jewish trait. He tried to copy it, but all he could do was spit out roast potatoes. By 9:30, John had been fully briefed on the virtues of Deborah Schlimmel by Mrs. Klein, and underneath that porcelain doll exterior lay a woman who was called in by unions and management to physically break strikes when factory workers refused to accept arbitration decisions. And that was a really tough job, but Deborah she was definitely up to it. And John and Deborah, they thanked Mrs. Klein for her hospitality. She sort of told them you might have a stroke washing all those dishes, but it was worth it for the match. Outside Mrs. Klein's apartment, it was Deborah's idea. She said, let's sleep together immediately, in a voice that boomed loud enough for all the neighbours to hear. And so, sleeping with Deborah that night in his apartment, it was like making love to a thundering steam locomotive. I think I can, and getting louder and louder, following by the deafening shriek of the whistle when the train reaches the top. And afterward, John had ringing in his ears for days, like tinnitus. It was poor, full on for him. A week later, Mrs. Klein came to him the following week, right? And she was pushing on that day a wheelie frame. which is a contraption with wheels that old people have to run over people. She said, "What happened? You didn't ring Deborah Schlimmel." He said, "Well, the chemistry wasn't right." And so Mrs. Klein said, "You're a loser who's particular, and that's the worst kind of a loser." And so she said, "Come to my place Saturday, 3 o'clock. Yelled, "Out of my way, Mr. Fussy," and she ran over his foot with the wheelie frame. And 3 o'clock the next Saturday, there were 3 females ensconced on Mrs. Klein's sofa, and they were devouring honey cake, and they were discussing the stock market. And one was a blonde, and one was a redhead, and one was wearing a wig that was the color of like aluminium or something unnatural. And they were called Paula, Shirley, and Susie. And Mrs. Klein, of course, introduced them and said in this really loud voice, "Which one do you like?" And it was like perfect Jewish match or something. They had to pick one, and they were all listening, and everyone was in there, and there was no discretion anywhere. And John was trying to be diplomatic, so he sort of said, "They're all nice." And Mrs. Klein said, "What are you, a Casanova? You're a loser, just pick one." He was put on the spot really badly. But after that afternoon, he was given the phone numbers of all of them, and he called Paula, and she was a fascinating lawyer, and she had a fine mind, and she had an incredible body, but she had a tendency to mumble, and she would start off a sentence, "I wonder if we should go," and he would go, "Pardon," and he would go, "The what?" And they would get very confused. She would be speaking into it like her hand or something. So it wasn't working out. So he invited the next on the list for a date, Shirley, and she came to visit. And from the moment she entered, like she was on a mobile, and buy, sell, do, make. She was like from that old film Wall Street. She was greed is good or something. It wasn't going to work out because obviously Shirley was a busy woman, and the market was in crisis at every moment. Next, he rang Susie. That was the next one on the list, and she sort of came in, and the first thing she said was, "I wear this wig because underneath is a bad haircut, and that'll take a year to grow out." And she sort of started complaining how society judges people by their looks, and she was asking him, "Do you judge people by their looks? Do you, huh?" And she put him on the spot, and he wasn't really sure whether he did or not. So that it wasn't working out. The phone rang, and Mrs. Klein had got his number, and she was harassing him over the phone, and she was saying, "Are you such a prize that these 3 girls aren't good enough for you? Look in the mirror," she said to him. And he said, "Look, it's not that simple. The woman has to be special for me." And Mrs. Klein said, "Special? You should be looking for on special, not special. Come to my place Sunday, 1 o'clock. And so the next Sunday at 1 o'clock, John walked into Mrs. Klein's apartment, and there was Trish Halm, the girl from the office who was like across the aisle, and she was eating baked cheesecake there. And he was shocked, of course, but he was like ecstatic inside secretly. And Trish Halm said, "I didn't know you were Jewish." Just kept smiling, really. By the time John and Trish had announced their engagement, Mrs. Klein had actually broken her hip. She promised. She kept promising, and finally it happened. And her condition, unfortunately, was progressively deteriorating. And so the day before they got married, Tricia and John, they visited Mrs. Klein in hospital. And for one split second, she came out of her coma. And what she said was, "You're marrying a loser," to Trish. And Trish said, "Tell me something I don't know." John knew that finally he was lucky in love and couldn't stop smiling.